This is Midori, a Trackmania full-speed map with elements of bobsleigh that I created, set in a floating island scenery. At a first glance, this map looks pretty innocent, but it is home to the biggest controversy in Trackmania in 2022. And the story behind why is a pretty interesting one. It all started when I got the idea to host a challenge. I wanted to build a track perfectly suited to my skill set and try to grind it for a near impossible author time. The first 5 players to beat the author time would get $1,000 in prizes, as well as real-life author medals. 1 second. Like, that's pretty cool, right? That looks amazing. I thought this was a fantastic idea, but things didn't exactly go as planned. The track was released on the 23rd of July, and within just 24 hours, several pro players had claimed the time I set was outright unbeatable, and that I had cheated when I drove the author time. And as it turns out, they weren't entirely wrong. Though not on purpose, the way I drove the Midori author time was so controversial that I almost got myself banned from Trackmania. But now that the dust has finally settled, it's time to tell the story of how Midori became Trackmania's most controversial track. When it comes to building Trackmania maps, there is no greater honor a creator can receive than having their track be chosen as track of the day. Every day, the developers sift through thousands of tracks to choose the one track that becomes officially added as that day's track of the day. In April of 2022, I started building Midori, with hopes of making something of such good quality that it could receive the track of the day status. This was a good starting point, but the surroundings so far were incredibly tame. The scenery on a Trackmania map is really what can make it feel magical and come to life. And for this, I got the help of Trackmania streamer Maji, who put in over 40 hours of work into turning what was no more than just a simple sketch into this breathtaking landscape. The attention to detail and the overall result is honestly quite stunning, and I really recommend checking out her channel to see exactly how she does it. With the scenery in place, the track was complete, and I started grinding for the aforementioned Author Time Challenge. When I first started doing speedruns of Midori, I thought a time under 45 seconds would be amazing. But not long after, I managed to get that with relative ease. And I still felt I had a long way left to go to optimize the track. Soon, I found myself stuck at 44:57. All things considered, a good time on the track. But annoyingly, in that run, I messed up the very last corner and lost a couple of hundredths there. I told myself I would go for one final improvement and leave it at that, as I had already played the map now for over 15 hours in total. And then, this run happened. "44,458. This was beyond anything I could have expected, and a worthy challenge to anyone who wanted to get the real-life author medals. Stylistically, Midori is all about snowballing speed. If you ever manage to squeeze out a tiny speed advantage early on, it will often translate into greater and greater time gains throughout the track. To keep up with my author time, players couldn't afford to miss a single detail, especially early into the run. The author run had a great ice wiggle in the start downhill, followed by a precise low jump into the bobsled, and a really good first bobsleigh turn. Bobsleigh turns are where things start to get interesting. When you're driving a bobsleigh turn, you always want to be steering a little bit, but the exact amount depends on how fast you're going. For a low-speed bobsleigh turn, the ideal steering amount might be as high as 60%. And for a hyperspeed turn, it could be as low as 25%. The essential principle at work is that the faster you are, the less you should steer. When Trackmania 2020 released, this absolutely sucked for keyboard players, since keyboard players have the choice of not steering at all at 0% or full steering at 100%, but no values in between. so in any bobsleigh turn, you were bound to lose time. This led some professional keyboard players like Kappa to getting creative, and driving competitions with a hybrid input setup, where he would use keyboard for the majority of the run, and then whenever a bobsleigh turn appeared, he would use a controller that he had lying on his desk to gently steer through the turn, and then continue on keyboard afterwards. The developers found this silly, and they wanted to introduce something to bridge the gap between keyboard and controller. So they made something called action keys. Action keys are essentially just macros. When used, they let you lock your steering at different percentages. In my opinion, they're a great addition to the game, as they give keyboard players a fighting chance without having to switch input device. A theoretically perfect turn could still be won massively favored towards controller players, where say you have to enter it steering 49.2% and exit it with like 42.4%. But in other situations, action keys could be favored. With the consistency that action keys provide, where you just hold one button and get 40% all the time, it could be easier than trying to estimate that on an analog stick. Entering the first bobsleigh turn on Midori, you are driving at 400 speed, which happens to line up with when 40% steering is the sweet spot. Following that, you have to precisely speed slide on the dirt and the platform before the wall ride, before you get to the second bobsleigh turn. At this point, you are going at 540 speed, meaning the bobsleigh steering needs to be much lower than in the first turn. As a keyboard player, you have the options of either turning 40% or 20%, both of which are not ideal. In testing, I discovered that the steering angle that seemed to gain the most speed was right around 34%. But how exactly can you achieve that on a keyboard? In the summer of 2021, the keyboard company Wirtual sent me one of their models that they wanted me to try and give feedback on so they could improve their analog keyboards for Trackmania players. The really powerful thing about this keyboard though is that it allows you to customize a lot of things. The user can set which buttons they want to be the analog ones and exactly what analog curve they should have. So if you wanted an analog key to produce, say 29% steering when fully pressed down, their software allows you to do that. This is where the heart of the issue lies. I was convinced that this was the future for keyboard players in Trackmania. So ever since I received it, I've been using it as my main keyboard. I've showed on stream many times how it works and what I'm trying to do with it. I've talked about it in several discords with pro players, and I even planned on making a video detailing exactly how it works. But unfortunately, that one fell to the wayside. At the time of setting the Midori author medal, I'd been using this keyboard for over a year, with no pushback or problems, and I really thought nothing more of it. I just went about my usual way of gaming. So to get the 34% steering in the second and third bobsleigh turn, I just used an analog profile on my keyboard and held the key all the way to get 34% steering. This made my car accelerate a lot through the bobsleigh turns, and I was able to carry that speed over the great platforms by speed sliding and maintaining the lead. As I crossed the finish line, I got a massive 1200th improvement, and I told myself, that is that. The speed loss from using 40% steering instead of 34% in the last two bobsleigh turns is actually quite significant, and it seemed like there was no way to beat the author time with Action Key 2. Elcon, who is one of the world's best ice and full speed players, and a clear favorite to win the challenge, was still 3500ths behind the author medal after grinding for an entire day. To clear up the confusion, I decided to post a tweet where I explained how I'd driven my author time. This, however, disappointed a lot of people. The perception at the time was that I had just made a map with an author time so ridiculous that the only way to beat it was by going out and buying an analog keyboard for $150 and then setting up your own custom action keys to get enough speed out of the last two bobsleigh turns. Many were rightfully upset and argued that this should be considered cheating, but up until this point there had been no rules on what is allowed and what isn't with an analog keyboard. Despite the best effort by people in the community to have a rational discussion, things quickly got out of hand. Many hate tweets started flying back and forth, massive Reddit threads were made, thousands of Discord messages from sunrise until sunset. Two players even went as far as blatantly cheating to get the author time, claiming that if Wirtual can cheat, then so can we. They did this by modifying the game's physics to permanently give themselves a reactor booster, and then driving to the finish with an impressive 6 seconds faster time, and then trying to claim the prize money. Not gonna lie, I hadn't expected that when I set up this challenge. Unfortunately though, both of these players got banned from the game as soon as Nadeo returned from their vacation. As it turns out, modifying your input device and modifying the game's physics aren't one and the same thing. The next day, Elcon managed to set up his controller as a custom action key. By using a program called DX-Tweak, he could limit the steering range of the analog stick to be 34%. And then, much like Kappa's hybrid setup, that is how he played the track. After many hours of grinding that day, Elcon eventually got this run. A very impressive 44.437, becoming the first player to successfully beat my time and the first player to claim a Midori author medal and $400 in prizes. After talking with my community about it on stream and speaking directly with Carl Jr., the 5-time world champion of Trackmania, it was clear there were big concerns about this becoming the meta in the game. Part of the beauty of Trackmania is that you only really need 4 buttons to compete: up, down, left, and right. If using custom action keys was necessary to beat my author time, that would kind of defeat the purpose, as the difficulty would be made really arbitrary. It was no longer about high skill driving, but who had the most advanced setup. After realizing my mistake, I decided to grind Midori again, but this time by only using in-game action keys of 40, 60, and 80% steering, to set a time on a setup that everyone has access to. After playing for a couple of hours, I managed to get a 44.573, 1100 slower than my custom action key time, but still much faster than everyone except Elcon on the map. I decided to make this the new unofficial author time on Midori and change the rewards so that anyone who beat the 44.573 would still be eligible to win the prizes. Over the following days, the player Yon123405 would become the second person to beat the author time, and the player Mata2002 would get it as well, though both of them had also used a 34% steering setup. This still counted for prizes, as we had yet to receive any ruling from the developers. 2 spots now remained in the pricing, and as I was looking at the field of contenders, I noticed something very interesting. The player Shadowcrancer was going for the ultimate Chad move, playing the entire track on controller from start to finish. For reasons I won't get too much into now, this loses a lot of time in the start, as the wiggle down the bobsleigh is best done on either keyboard or the D-pad. But the interesting part was that in the bobsleigh turn, by moving the control stick with surgical precision, he was gaining time compared to those that just used a 34% action key. Doing this in the second and third bobsleigh turn on Midori, Shadowcrancer was gaining upwards of 4 to 5 speed, compared to just holding 1 steering value, and ultimately proving that the real action keys had been joysticks all along. The Trackmania community, and myself included, had gotten so lost in the sauce of which action key was the best, the drama and the memes, that we overlooked the fundamental principle at work, that gradually reducing steering is better for hitting the sweet spot steering angle. This is how bobsleigh should be done perfectly. But next to nobody had actually bothered trying it, since just pressing 1 button and getting a decent result was much easier. After seeing it, I was very curious to try it myself, and I quickly discovered that it is indeed very difficult. The only strategy to make this even somewhat consistent was by using a legal plugin for the game called Dashboard, which lets you have an input display on screen at all times. Then you would drive a bobsleigh turn and stare at the input display and try to estimate when the arrow was about 35% filled up. After taking a while to get used to it, I was getting much faster attempts, and all that remained was chaining everything together in one run. 44.416. 400s faster than my original author time and temporarily the world record on the map. But the final time doesn't really tell the full story. Exiting the second bobsleigh turn, this run had a speed advantage of 5 over my 34% steering run, which meant that if the entry to the next turn was better, this run could have been a low 44.3, which would be far out of reach of what you could do with any action key. Soon after, Shadowcrancer also managed to beat the author time, and one day later, Mudda became the 5th player to beat 44.57, rounding out the pricing, both of them doing it on a controller. The medals came out looking amazing. The company WinMed did an amazing job designing them as close as possible to the in-game medals, and I'm very happy to be able to give these away to these 5 successful players. But this isn't quite where the story ends. What was the aftermath of all this? Were custom action keys allowed or considered cheating? Were records I had driven with this keyboard still on the leaderboard, or did they have to be removed? On the 5th of August, we got some answers, when Nadeo made a statement addressing the issue. In the statement, they said the following: seeing the controversy about these action keys, instead of looking at the ways players try and maximize their advantage, it rather pushes us to revisit, for instance, ice bobsleigh gameplay, ideally to reach a situation where these methods would be too marginal for top performance. Later it reads, our hope and ambition is to make different input devices close enough without requiring analog single action keys, and to eventually maybe even remove action keys entirely. Using a personal custom key to lock your steering automatically at an optimized angle is unfairly advantageous when consistency is valued as a skill, and therefore will be considered unwanted and disallowed until further notice. We will not sanction players or records for this retroactively, as we agree that this has been a very difficult topic without clear rulings before. Players who may have used this method before this article are not considered to have been cheating, but this article does serve as a warning going forward. Quickly summarized, they're disallowing custom action keys from now on, but they will not penalize players, like myself, thankfully, who have used them in the past, since they did not have any rules about them back then. They also alluded to potential physics changes for bobsleigh and ice, to remove the need for action keys and improve the long-term health of the game. When Nadeo say they are looking to do big changes like this, it's usually assumed that these will be far in the future, but only a couple of weeks later, it was rumored by people with inside knowledge that an update to ice and bobsleigh was coming as close as the 1st of October. This update would make bobsleigh so that it's equally fast on keyboard and controller, which sounds like a great idea. But this update was also going to permanently change the game, because if the rumors were true, it would make any tracks featuring either bobsleigh or ice much slower. There's a community in Trackmania that collects Track of the Day author medals. There's over 700 in total now, and to get them all, you need to grind a lot of different tracks for a lot of different incredibly hard medals. But out of those 700 maps, Midori would be the first one to become officially impossible after this physics update. And they realized they had just a little over a month to get to work if they wanted to get it before the doors shut close forever. The player Monkey grinded the track for over 150 hours in total, but luckily, he would be rewarded for his effort when he got an astonishing 44.336 on the track. A run that simply carried nearly perfect speed throughout the map, beating the author time by 1200ths of a second. Other players were not so fortunate. The players Spam and Dexter put in an equally Herculean effort. Having spent most of their time in Trackmania playing tight drifting tracks, bobsleigh full speed was quite out of their element. Both of them accrued upwards of 100 hours grinding Midori, getting excruciatingly close many times over. But as the 1st of October rolled around, both of them fell just a few hundred short of getting the medal. As the new physics update dropped, the first thing I did was go back to Midori to see the damages, only to quickly realize that there was absolutely no chance of beating the author time anymore. A great run on the track now would be about 3 seconds slower. Many of the most passionate ice and bobsleigh players really dislike this new update, and have made a petition for Nadeo to revert the changes. But knowing the alternative, it's hard to say what's better. You know, if only there was a competitive Trackmania game with over a decade-long history of records and leaderboards without any updates during that time? That'd be great. In the days since the patch, Midori has become completely abandoned. What started out as a fun and unique challenge has eventually turned into Trackmania's version of Chernobyl. A land so filled with toxicity that nobody really wants to go there. The drama and the uproar all of this created really makes it one of the most controversial Trackmania maps of all time. But perhaps we can turn this into a learning experience. Starting soon on my livestream, I'm going to be building Midori 2. And perhaps things can be done properly this time to create a challenge the way it was meant to be. Or perhaps I'll have to make another drama video in half a year's time. We'll see how this one goes.